Welcome to Homegrown History with Limestone County Archivist Rebekah Davis and longtime Athens, Alabama native Richard Martin. Each episode, Richard and Rebekah bring to life some of the famous and infamous stories etched in Limestone County's rich history.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Homegrown History, your Limestone County History podcast. I am your co-host, Rebekah Davis, the archivist at the Limestone County Archives. I am here with my co-host.
I'm Richard Martin, the oldest one here.
That's right. Thank you for joining us again. And today we have another couple of special guests and a really great topic to discuss today. We're going to talk about the Scottsboro Boys case of the 1930s and local hero, I think he's a hero, Judge James Edwin Horton Jr. And that's something that the Limestone County Archives has been very active involved with. But also today we have two more experts in this topic. First and foremost, we have Peggy Towns, who is here from Decatur. Peggy is, I think, the preeminent historian of African-American history in North Alabama.
Amen. Amen.
Yes, and she has written several books. She's done countless programs and outreach efforts. Her latest book is Scottsboro Unmasked. Oh, it's not her latest book. She's still working on another one.
No, actually, where have you been?
At the Limestone County Archives, obviously.
I published a book, Scapegoat, the Tommy Hines story, in November of last year.
Oh, we'll have to talk about that later. Okay. So her not most recent book is Scottsboro Unmasked, Decatur's story that talks about the Decatur connection to the Scottsboro Boys case. Peggy, we appreciate you coming up here from Decatur to join us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Always a delight to talk to Peggy. And we also have someone from even farther away. We have Steve Brown. He is a professor at Auburn University who has also written a book, Alabama Justice, The Cases and Faces That Changed a Nation. So Steve, he has studied extensively on this case as well. Steve and I also spent a good couple of years going here and there around the state with Alabama Humanities Alliance Rhodes Scholars Program to give training sessions to police officers regarding this case. So Steve, he came up from Auburn this morning and braved the traffic. So thank you, Steve, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
We appreciate y'all being here. So I'd like to jump right in to the case. And actually, would one of you like to start in with the background of what happened and who were the Scottsboro Boys?
Okay, so May 1931, a group of hobos jumped a train in Chattanooga, headed back to Alabama, or through Alabama, I should say, on the way to Memphis. Hobos black and white. So just as the train crossed into Alabama, a fight ensued between white and black hobos. The blacks got the best of the whites. The whites jump off in Stevenson. Mm-hmm. They report the fight to a storekeeper who actually was a part-time deputy. Mm-hmm. He calls the sheriff. The sheriff calls ahead to Scottsboro, but the train had just sped by. Mm-hmm. And so then he calls to Paint Rock and tell them to deputize every person that you can and bring in every Negro on the train. Mm-hmm. And so a posse is lined up on each side of the railroad track with makeshift weapons, guns, pitchforks and everything. And so when the train stops, they pull off 9 black youth as well as 3 whites.
Mm-hmm. So these were all young men that were pulled off, but among these hobos that were pulled off were 2 young women, young white women wearing men's clothing, weren't they?
That's correct.
And they kind of took off, and when they got stopped, they said, "We were raped." And their names were Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. So they were from Huntsville, and they had been up in Chattanooga too. Tell us a little bit about what happened next, Steve.
Well, so just to back up to when they were pulled off the train, my understanding is that when the young men were pulled off the train, they were basically going to be charged with assault. And they were tied up, put onto a flatbed truck, and then taken into Scottsboro. And after they left is when these 2 young women emerged, and then the allegations of rape. And so by that evening, the Scottsboro jail is surrounded by people who have now heard about these allegations of rape by these 9 young black men, ages 13 to 19, about 13 to 20. And it's a mob. It's an absolute mob that night. And no one's questioned these young women in terms of the veracity of their allegations. It's just assumed that these young men, all of them, have done this. And an early hero in this is Sheriff Matt Wan, who's the sheriff there in Scottsboro, who is able to keep the mob away long enough so that the National Guard can be called in to protect the young men. And they're taken to Decatur and jailed there. But for that evening, it looked very likely that they'd all be lynched.
Right. Well, and it's my understanding that within just a couple of weeks, they were all tried and all found guilty, just one after the other.
All but one.
That's right. That's right.
And that was the youngest.
Yes.
But even he went to jail.
That's right.
Even he went to jail.
And when you say youngest, he was only, what, 12?
12. Some people say 13.
Right,
Yeah.
right. All of these were teenagers at the time. And, you know, of note, one of them, he had STDs so badly he couldn't even walk. Another one was blind. And the doctor who examined the women at the time.
Another hero.
Yes.
Yep.
That's right. Even then, he said, you know, this doesn't really appear, their story doesn't match up with the evidence. But it was 1931. Yellow Mama had just been built, the electric chair, and was quickly taking the place of ropes around the South. And one of the things that could get a black man lynched quicker than anything was allegations of assault or even attempted assault on a white woman, regardless of the woman's character. And these two women, like I said, they were hobos. They were also known to be prostitutes in the mill villages in Huntsville. And that's really why they were crossing the lines. And so as the evidence showed over the years, over the trials, once it came to retrial, really their story didn't add up. But that's what it was like. And in fact, when they announced the guilty verdicts in Scottsboro, there was a huge mob there that cheered, and the local band played There'll Be a Hot Time in Old Town Tonight.
And Dixie.
Yeah, that's right. And Dixie. And so, you know, this was just business as usual in the Jim Crow South when it came to something like that. And a black man could pretty much expect sure and certain death if he was accused of defiling what was considered pure white Southern womanhood. And so all of Alabama and the South were really shocked when the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the convictions, weren't they? And it was on the grounds of incompetent defense because their defense lawyer, one person noted that he was so stewed he could scarcely walk straight.
Yeah, and I only say a couple of the young men came from Chattanooga. Actually, 4 of the young men from Chattanooga. Stephen Roddy was a real estate attorney who had dealings with both white and black clients. And the ministers of some African-American churches up there said, can you go down there and just observe this? And just, you know, they didn't dare come down themselves. They said, as a white attorney, can you go down there and check this out? And so he shows up, and basically when the trial's about to begin, and when Judge Hawkins asks, so who's here for the young men? The only one that is there is a Scottsboro attorney named Milo Moody, who is very, very old. He'd been a member of the 1901 Constitutional Convention and had been apparently a lawyer of some repute at one point, but this time is very, very old. They called him an old, doddering, senile old fool, I think is how he was characterized. So anyway, Judge Hawkins is an interesting guy because he, knowing the circumstances, he said, we're going to do this right. We're not going to leave this up to Judge Lynch. We're going to have a trial. We're going to do these things. He seemed to be very focused on due process right up to the start of the trial. But when Milo Moody is appointed to be counsel, and when he says, is anybody else here to help, Stephen Roddy stands up and says, I'm here to assist. And in the course of a conversation that's reprinted in the Supreme Court opinion, Judge Hawkins says, oh, so you're the guy that's going to help. He says, well, I'm going to assist. And he says, so you're the man. Milo Moody can help you. And he begs off any way he can, saying, I haven't had time. I don't know the procedure down here. I probably have to just step out. And Hawkins says, no, you're the guy, and gives him 25 minutes to meet with his clients.
Wow.
What I find fascinating about all of this is that whether he was stewed or not, that's one of the guards mentioned that. And even Clarence Norris said he smelled of alcohol during that 25 minutes. But he tries to get a change of venue because of all the press coverage, early press coverage. And Judge Hawkins says you can't demonstrate that the press coverage was so biased that it'll affect the outcome of this trial. He tries to undercut Victoria Price's testimony. And again, the state of Alabama is going to go ahead and object to his questioning. All of those objections are upheld. When he tries to object himself, all of those are turned down. he tries every way he can. And so I know that the common wisdom about him is he was drunk and he was out of his league. He was definitely out of his league. But he did the best he could. And I personally think a sober attorney on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys at that time wouldn't have done any better. When you look at the trial transcript, he clearly is trying to gauge the best he can. But so yes, when it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court says a real estate attorney from Tennessee that is having his first criminal trial in a capital case in Alabama, 25 minutes with clients, has no time to prepare. It was ineffective counsel and remands the case back down to Alabama to do it the right way. And I might add that when the case was decided here in Scottsboro, it went to the Alabama Supreme Court. The Chief Justice Anderson of the Alabama Supreme Court said the same thing in dissent. Said these guys, this whole thing was ramrodded through. It should have taken more time and a little bit more care. So anyway, but yeah, Stephen Roddy definitely was out of his league.
And at that same time, too, Eugene Williams, they found out that he was too young to stand trial as well.
That's right. Yeah. And so once they remanded it back down, then there was change of venue to Decatur, Alabama, and the old Morgan County Courthouse.
That's correct.
So that's where the Decatur connection comes in. And then they had to pick a judge. And then the Athens-Limestone County connection was Judge Horton. And he did not set out to be a civil rights hero. He came from a family, his father was Judge Horton Sr., who was the probate judge in Limestone County. Side note, great man, horrible handwriting. We have his probate records at the Limestone County Archives. You can't read them. They're just totally illegible. And I'm pretty good at reading old cursive, crappy handwriting these days. I have to read Richard's handwriting, and I've done it for years, and it's awful. But Judge Horton's is worse. But they were a very prominent white family here in town. They had owned slaves before emancipation. They still had the help in their family. And so, he did not set out to be, he did not come with some sort of bias of, I'm going to make my name by civil rights. But he was known to be a fair judge. And so he was tapped to take on this case, which is really sort of like what you mentioned with Roddy. Nobody really wanted this hot potato, at least at first. Nobody in the South did, for sure.
That's right. The Alabama Supreme Court were the ones that selected him. They could have picked anybody else, but because of his reputation for fairness and other things, they thought he's the guy. We've already looked poorly because of the Supreme Court decision. He's the guy that'll make sure it'll be done right. And so he already had that type of reputation for fairness and for doing the right thing.
Exactly. Well, and while nobody in the South may have wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole, it did start off a tug of war, didn't it, between the NAACP and the Communist Party. Do either of you want to kind of address that? Or I can.
I was just saying the Communist Party early on was probably the first integrated social movement that you'd had since before the Civil War. The temperance movement, some early women's rights movement, different things like that had been integrated as well. But the Communist Party, they said the ills of this system, of the capitalist system, affect both whites and blacks. And they had a great deal of African American support. So they jumped in pretty early on. The NAACP tried to as well, but by that time, the young men, their families, had committed to the Communist Party's, again, the ILD, which was the International Legal Defense Organization, which was their legal arm. And so at that point, yes, it was a little bit of a struggle between the two. But, yeah. The other thing that's interesting, unfortunately, is that as this now, particularly during the trial in Judge Horton's courtroom, becomes a worldwide phenomenon because of the Communist Party and its worldwide presence, the young men, in my opinion, unfortunately, kind of become a useful tool for both the NAACP and the Communist Party, such that when all this is over, for their purposes, the young men are kind of cast aside. And that's a sad thing to observe and watch with this. But at the time, because the Communist Party said in terms of justice and how you ought to treat African Americans and this great injustice happening in Alabama, they were, the poster boys for what the Communist Party hoped they could bring about in terms of attracting more support and things like that.
Right. And then the Communist Party, the International Labor Defense, ILD, they hired what at the time was the best lawyer in the country.
That's correct.
Samuel Leibowitz from New York. There's a very famous picture, I'm actually looking it up on my screen right now, of Leibowitz in the jail cell with all the boys crowded around him as he's taking notes. And I want to mention, while I mentioned those photos, I would be remiss not to give a shout out to the Morgan County Archives in Decatur, Alabama. They were able to acquire the photos that were taken of the first retrial. And if you want to go take a look at that, they have an exhibit there. They have a traveling version of that. And just recently, they got the witness stand that was used during that trial too. So there's a lot of great photos. You can see an image. You actually get the picture of what was going on in that retrial.
And Rebecca, those are the only photographs of the trials, period.
That's right.
Because when Judge Callahan became jurist, he banned cameras from the courtroom.
Yes. That's exactly right. So those are a treasure.
Yes.
Treasure. And so in the spring of 1933, the retrial began in March of 1933, and Judge Horton was presiding in the Decatur courtroom. And of course, all the eyes of the world were on Judge Horton, and they were all writing, begging for justice. And we know this because of the lard bucket. I want to mention that. I'm maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but I want y'all to know some of the ways we know what was going on kind of behind the scenes, beyond the testimony that has been recorded in the official record. Judge Horton kept all the letters, all the newspaper clippings, and everything that was sent to him, telegrams, resolutions, editorials, he kept them all over the course of from March 1933 all the way through the end of the retrial of Haywood Patterson. He was the first one to be retried, and he was kind of chosen specifically, wasn't he, to be the first?
Yes, he was.
Tell us a little bit about that, Peggy.
Well, Haywood Patterson was actually involved in the fight on the train, and he was more outspoken than any of the others. So he was chosen first. And actually, Leibowitz had asked that they all be tried together. And Judge Horton decided they will be tried individually. And, prior to when the actual trial started, Leibowitz, Roski, and Chamberlain had gone over to Old Town, which is a black community, and they had actually met with the Ministerial Alliance and brought people in because his first task was to take on the Alabama legal system.
Right.
So because of the Scottsboro Boys case in Scottsboro, and they're named Scottsboro because they weren't arrested in Scottsboro, but it's because the first trial was held in Scottsboro. And I tell people all the other trials, the retrials, were held in Decatur, Alabama from 1933 to 1937. But when Leibowitz went to Old Town, what he did was garner African Americans who did not feel that they would be ostracized or that there would be any repercussions. And most people in many of the books, they talk about the first list, but there were 11 black men who were called to testify that they were qualified to serve as jurors, and that there had not been any blacks to serve on petty jurors or grand jurors that they could remember since Reconstruction, actually.
Exactly, yeah.
So, and many people think that there was only one list. There were actually 4 lists. And these were prominent African Americans. Most of them had 2 or 3 college educations. They owned property. They were of good moral turpitude.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so, they testified, and actually their testimony, as well as some of the men who were blacks who were from Jackson County, because of that, then we had the second United States Supreme Court ruling.
That's right, because 500 or so college-educated Negroes in Morgan County at the time, none of those were chosen for the jury. It was all white, all male. 4 of the jurors that were chosen had actually dropped out of school before they ever even went to high school. And so these were the ones that Judge Horton, this was the jury that Haywood Patterson had. I don't think I finished about the lard bucket. He kept all the letters that were sent to him and telegrams, and he kept them all in a lard bucket. And a few years ago, when some folks here in Athens and Limestone County, headed up by the Lawyers Association, who worked to put up a statue to him, his daughter-in-law came to the archives one day and she said, I have a lard bucket at my house that's got all the letters that Judge Horton saved from the trials. would you be interested in that? I said, yes, ma'am. So we know a lot about what kind of pressure he was facing and what the reaction was, not just around the country, but around the world.
I went through those letters.
Yeah.
Okay. They were from France. They were from Russia. They were from everywhere.
Everywhere. And part of that was because of the Communist Party really rallied the support. I mean, we think about in our lifetime, you've got like the O.J. Simpson trial, that was like the big media thing. Well, this was like the O.J. Simpson trial of its day. People marched down the streets of Harlem in support. Albert Einstein wrote a letter in support of the Scottsboro Boys. And then you had lots of other people who wrote in letters and even death threats against the Scottsboro Boys and directed those at Judge Horton too. I mean, he had death threats from both sides saying, if you don't choose the way we want you to,
correct,
you better watch your back.
And ILD actually instituted a letter writing campaign. So
yeah, one of the things to note in that bucket full of letters is there are several copies of the exact same resolution with just different organizations filled in. Like you've got the Young Workers of Birmingham, you've got the Lithuanian workers, you've got, the Jamaican workers, all of this where they had the exact same thing, but they just filled in what they wanted, what they demanded from Judge Horton and the jury as far as justice for the Scottsboro Boys, which in their mind was to find them not guilty. But then you had just as many letters that, demand justice, which was to let them fry. They did not want to see the boys get off. I say boys, they were teenagers, but really, they were. I think about this. My sons are 16 and 15. These were the same age as these. And in my mind, these are still boys, and they were facing death for a man's crime.
And, even though the youngest, they were still held in prison the entire time.
Oh, yes. Yes, for years. Yes. Because it first happened in 31. Haywood Patterson's retrial was in 33. And then you had the series of retrials. I often think, I know those boys rued the day they ever got on that train in Chattanooga. It altered the course of their lives. And unimaginably. They could not have imagined it.
And just recently, the state archives found the intake prison records. So they were phenomenal.
Right. That's right. And I believe they are digitized on the Alabama State Archives. So if you go to archives.alabama.gov, you can see those there. And I know that some of the testimony is in the record books there at the Morgan County Archives as well. I think this quote, this is, like I said, all white, all male jury. And what he told them in his first charge to the jury pool, what Judge Horton told him, he said, now, gentlemen, under our law, when it comes to the courts, we know neither native nor alien. We know neither Jew nor Gentile. We know neither black nor white, native or foreign born. But to each it is our duty to mete out even-handed justice. There is no other way of enjoying the fruits of liberty except by following the law as laid out to you and obeying the law as it is. So, he tried to set the tone from the get-go. But the reality was quite different as far as what was going on both inside and outside the courtroom, wasn't it? Do you want to talk a little bit about what was going on in Decatur as Haywood Patterson and Victoria Price and all were testifying?
Well, of course, the 425 seats, the courtroom was packed, and the sheriff had designed the first come, first serve. So there were people lined up in the hall, and it's interesting because when you look at the photographs at the archives, you see that even the lines were segregated as they were standing out in the hall. But a portion of the courtroom, of course, was designated for whites, and then a portion for blacks. The two black reporters that Judge Horton had allowed to come in sat at a makeshift desk over near the segregated section for blacks. So Victoria Price, she's the first to testify.
She was something else.
She sure was. 16-minute testimony, and Leibowitz had a model train set, and she just, okay, no, I wasn't on that train. That's a Tory.
Right, exactly.
So she just was a character, and her description of the alleged attack was so descriptive that Some of the men even bowed their head because they could not believe what she was saying. And you have to keep in mind, she had originally said, and she and Ruby Bates were actually, I think they concocted the story because they were afraid that they would be arrested because of the Mann Act. Right. If you recall, Jack Johnson was in jail for the Mann Act as well as Chuck Berry.
Right, and the Mann Act regarded crossing state lines for sex work.
For immoral purposes.
Right. Oh, immoral. That's right. Immoral
but you're exactly right.
Well, they were sex workers.
So, but one of the things that I like is just the dramatics of it because a prosecutor in Scottsboro also assisted Thomas Knight, who was actually the youngest prosecutor in the state at that time. Mm-hmm. So they pulled out, first time in Decatur, it was not evidence in Scottsboro, a pair of panties, white step-ins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what we called them, step-ins back then.
And he asks Victoria, were these the ones that you had on? And of course, she says yes. And so they put them into evidence. And then all of a sudden, Knight gets up and he throws those panties into a juror's lap. Yeah. So it's just a lot of dramatics.
Yeah, I know Leibowitz, in asking for a new trial towards the end, after all of this went down, I know he went back over some of the things that Knight did and said, and, you know, he used the N-word frequently. Yes. He said, we don't call on a, N-word to corroborate a white man's story, no matter who that may be. And I know he really just kind of gave Thomas Knight what for his biased and racist, discriminatory remarks to the jury, characterizing these young men and the lawyers and so on from New York basically as animals.
Right. And that was, even today we still, and it's just, we look and we say, well, we progress, but have we really? Because you still have anti-Black, anti-Semitics. You still have that going on today.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, and so Victoria Price, she had her kind of scandalous testimony, and maybe it was you who had said at one point, it was like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall, wasn't it, Steve?
I think Leibowitz was stunned. He is one of the best attorneys in the country, someone who's never stymied in his previous trials, and he just simply could not get her to bend at all. I mean, she stuck to her story, as incredulous as it might be, and she just stuck to it. I think he was very surprised by that.
Right. So. Right. And there's a very striking photo of her sitting in the courtroom pointing. Yep. They said, you remember what happened, this and that? And she said, I don't know, but I do know one thing. That Negro sitting over there raped me, Haywood Patterson, and pointed at him. And
you have to remember, Rebecca, that the original story is that they were at Callie Broach's house. Right. In Chattanooga.
That's right.
And so then they have, Leibowitz has some blacks to come in from Chattanooga who actually saw them in the hobo jungle. And then later on, even one of the family members, she said, well, when she testified, she said, well, I went through the phone book and I did not see where there was ever a Callie Broachy in Chattanooga. Yes. So, it's a lot of dynamics.
But they had been seen in the hobo jungle with their boyfriends.
And more than one occasion, not just this occasion, but previously as well.
Right.
And they jumped the train in Huntsville near the Glenwood Cemetery at that hobo jungle.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, and they, even when Dr. Bridges testified in Decatur, he said, well, upon the examination, what I found was a lot more consistent with that story of the hobo jungle than what you would find if you had two women who had been assaulted repeatedly by multiple men, that on a train. That's more, what they just described the hobo jungle was more without getting too graphic. But the testimony was graphic. It was, especially, in a day and age when people wouldn't even say the word pregnant because that was, scandalous. And that is of note because when Judge Horton rendered his decision that we'll talk about in a few minutes, he laid out the testimony. And tell about Judge Horton's background and why he might have possibly laid out that medical testimony. He was a doctor. He was a trained doctor.
He had gone to medical school.
Go ahead, you tell about that, Peggy.
Okay, yes, he had been to medical school prior to him deciding that he wanted to be an attorney. And you see him in the courtroom in the photographs talking to, he's actually leaning over, questioning Dr. Bridges about were they hysteria, how was the heartbeat, all of that. And so that played into his decision, too. I love that June decision when he talked about it. So, yes,
exactly. And we're going to get to that. So after the first day of testimony, which Victoria Price, that's when she testified. Haywood Patterson didn't testify until the next day. But in the meantime, it was a hot mess outside in Decatur. I mean, that's just the only way to put it. You had a mob outside, a whole carloads of folks from Huntsville and Scottsboro were trying to come to, quote unquote, take care of Leibowitz and the Scottsboro Boys. So Judge Horton said, fine, raise the bridge. Y'all remember the old Keller Memorial Bridge? How many times have you ever gotten stopped and didn't make it to your doctor's appointment in time because you had to wait on the bridge? But he raised the bridge to keep them from coming out.
And, actually, that was that evening. They had a meeting, and it was reported back to... And there are so many heroes in the story because Burleson had reported this back to...
Burleson, who was the National Guard captain.
To Judge Horton, that they had met and what their discussions were. And they were not just coming from Huntsville, but the Klan was coming from Athens, too.
That's correct. They're from Athens, from Decatur. They had met in a Decatur Lodge Hall to plan this mob attack. And so Burleson, he just brought in the National Guard. There's a picture in all of these pictures of the guards standing with all the mob behind them outside the courthouse on that second day when Haywood Patterson came to testify. And Judge Horton, before anybody testified, he said, all right, send out the jury. And he's like, this is for the audience. And we have his charge to the audience. And I won't go through the whole thing. It's 4 pages long, but he did say, a man who would engage in anything that would cause the death of any of these prisoners is a murderer. He's not only a murderer, but a cowardly murderer, and a man who we should look upon with all the contempt in our being. And he said, I'm going to say further that the soldiers here and the sheriffs are expected to defend with their lives these prisoners. And they have the authority of this court, that anybody who wants to try to do something to these young men, they must expect that they're going to forfeit their lives. And he says, I have no patience with the mob spirit and the spirit that would charge the guilt or innocence of any being without knowing if their guilt is innocence. He says, so far as I'm concerned, I believe I'm as gentle as any man in the world. I don't believe I would harm anyone wrongfully. But when it comes to a question of right or wrong, when it comes to the very civilization, men, no matter how quiet they are or how peaceful they are, there comes a time when they must take a stand, either right or wrong. And that's kind of how he conducted this, is he was here to determine right or wrong, And so then Haywood Patterson took the stand in his own defense, and he said, I didn't do what they're accusing me of. And then you had, the doctor testified, and you had others that testified. Meanwhile, there was a steady stream of envelopes coming to Judge Horton's desk. I mean, he mentioned this at the end of the trial. He's like, you may have seen that a great many telegrams have been delivered to me here, and I see it too, and they don't affect me whatsoever. They don't determine the truth and justice in this matter. But we've got in that lard bucket, there's telegrams from Harlem, letters from Paris. There's Joel Brown, Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, wrote in. They came from every direction. And you had some, I kind of consider them to be the granddaddies of modern day trolls, that, internet trolls that want to get on there somewhere anonymously and say horrible things. Well, that's not a new thing in this world. There were some that signed Justice, or a Civil War veteran of the South or of the North, who wrote in just really some hateful, horrible things assigned anonymously. And these were some of the things that were coming to the judge in the middle of this very intense trial.
And you talk about the telegraph. You do know that they had a makeshift telegraph office that was put up just for that trial.
No, I didn't know that. Was it there in the courthouse?
No, it was across the street from the courthouse.
Wow. No wonder there was just such a flood of telegrams coming in. Well, do one of you want to address then what happened with Ruby Bates when she showed up?
I'll only say that having, in the initial trial, corroborated everything that Victoria Price had said, and then she kind of disappeared off the map. Ruby Bates did, and so it was a great concern that you have one of the women who was alleged to have been raped, but not the other one. Mm-hmm. When she shows up, though, she looks very, very different, and she doesn't look like somebody that had been in a hobo jungle. Doesn't even look like dressed as a Southern woman typically would back then. She's dressed to the nines in very fashionable, up to date Northern style. And that is what's so fascinating to me, that when she comes and basically recants everything that she said in the Scottsboro trial, the prosecutors don't even focus on that. Don't try to undermine, well, why are you lying now? Why are you doing this right now? They then go after her saying, where did you get those clothes? Where have you been all this time? You don't have any money, and you don't have an education. How have you gotten along? So it becomes now more of a character assassination, and then finding her guilty by association with Northerners or with the communists, or with those who are Jewish. And again, Wade Wilson, wasn't it, who said to the jury, you need to know that, I have to quote, it's paraphrased, that justice in Alabama can't be bought with Jew money from New York.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That was his reference to her and the way she was dressed and things like that. So again, it had nothing to do with her testimony. It had everything to do with that she was seemed to be a different person, and they just simply shifted their strategy to attack her character and where she'd been, as opposed to she's saying something completely different now. It was very, very odd.
Yeah, exactly.
And she came in and Judge Horton asked her, well, why did you lie? They asked that question. And she said, well, I told it like Victoria told me, because she said we would be arrested for crossing those state lines. Mm-hmm. But, with Victoria, she would just say, when they would say, well, Ruby said this, and remember, they found that letter, too, that Ruby Bates had written. But Victoria would say, oh, that's some of Ruby's dope.
That's right. So once again, it became not really so much about the facts. It was more about preconceived notions and so on, and playing into the emotions of the jury and everybody in the room and everybody who was watching the trial. In fact, I'm about to read a portion of Judge Horton's charge to the jury before they began deliberating. And we have that because it was printed in the New York Times. And there were papers from, New York Times and other big newspapers, also a lot of Black-owned newspapers from all over the country covered this trial as well. And that's interesting to note how, those different perspectives of how it was covered.
But, I was just so surprised that Decatur Daily used the AP, Tom Davenport, to cover their stories rather than them getting involved with it.
Well, and the News Courier was the same way. Even though Judge Horton was a beloved judge, very well known in town, you don't see hardly anything about the trial at all in the local newspapers. It was something that they just kind of wanted to keep their hands off. They were not inclined to stay on that and to point out the fact that this was going on with one of Athens and Limestone County's own,
But the Black reporters, when we read these stories, we really get a different outlook.
That's exactly right.
From their we do see things differently.
Sure.
So, I pulled a lot of things from the Afro paper in the Norfolk Journal in my book because of their covering. So they told how they interacted with the neighborhood, and they told what they saw, too, in the courtroom.
So I would like to go into that more. I think what we need to do is create a bit of a cliffhanger because we're running up on the end of this episode. This case is just fascinating to me, and I love talking to y'all about it. I want to tell y'all about Judge Horton, what he told the jury before they went to deliberations, and then y'all going to have to come back for part 2 to find out what happened. What do y'all think? Let's do it. Okay, so they get to the end of testimony. Was there anything else y'all want to mention about the testimony before we go to deliberations? We're going to deliberate. We're going to come back. All right. So when the testimony was complete, and he charged the jury, he said, take the evidence, sift it out, and find the truths and untruths, and render your verdict. It will not be easy to keep your minds solely on the evidence. Much prejudice has crept into it. It has come not only from far away, but from here at home as well. I have done what I thought to be right as the judge of this court, no matter what the personal cost to me might be. I want y'all to stick a pin in that little phrase there. You are not trying whether or not the defendant is white or black. You are not trying that question. You are trying whether or not this defendant forcibly ravaged a woman. You are not trying lawyers. You're not trying state lines, but you are here at home as jurors, a jury of citizens under oath sitting in the jury box, taking the evidence and considering it, leaving out any outside influence. Things may vex you. I might say that the court has been vexed about a great many things. It may have been evident to you that a great many telegrams came in here to me since I have been here. But gentlemen, they do not affect me whatever, or the great principle which the court desires to see done, and the great thing the jury desires to see done, and that is to see justice done in this case. And this is the part that this is a quotable quote right here. And it's so timeless. We are a white race and a Negro race here together. We are here to live together. Our interests are together. The world at this time and in many lands is showing intolerance and showing hate. It seems sometimes that love has almost deserted the human bosom. It seems that only hate has taken its place. It is only for a time, gentlemen, because it is the great things in life, God's great principles, matters of eternal right, that alone live. Wrong dies, and truth forever lasts, and we should have faith in that. And with that, he remanded it to the jury. And with that, we're going to call a halt to part 1 and come back for part 2, where you can get to hear the rest of the story of Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys in this case. What do y'all say?
That's good.
All right. So with that, thank you for joining us for this episode of Homegrown History, and come back next time to hear the rest of the story.
You've been listening to Homegrown History, presented by the Athens-Limestone County Public Library and the Limestone County Archives in Athens, Alabama. For more information and to submit questions or suggestions, please visit limestonearchives.com. And to hear other recordings from our Library Voices series, check out our website at alcpl.org. You can also listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.